Hi, everybody. This is Ronelle, and I have another book. Actually, I don't have the book. I didn't buy the book. I downloaded it on my cell phone. It's called An Officer and a Spy. It was written by a very famous author named Robert Harris. Many years ago, Robert Harris stunned the book world by writing a novel called Fatherland. It must be 20 years ago that Robert Harris, a British author, wrote his first novel about the world after Adolf Hitler. Well, we know the world after Adolf Hitler, don't we? But not the world he invented for his novel. In Fatherland, Robert Harris continued life and history as if Adolf Hitler had won World War II. I've never read the book. I didn't want to know what could have happened. I'm sure it's not a pretty picture. I hope he ended the book with a victory for good rather than evil, but I don't know. I'm only interested in this book now that he's written, and he must have written 5 other novels in between Fatherland and the one I'm telling you about today, Officer and the Spy. He wrote this book, I think it's a couple of years old, 3-4 years old, but this officer has a name, which is Alfred Dreyfus. It's a familiar name. It should be throughout history. Everybody knows the name Dreyfus, Dreyfus. And so I'm going to show you a slideshow now. I'm going to share my screen. And we should come to slideshow from the beginning. There we are. Oh, well, I did forget to share the sound. So let's go back, start over again, share screen, share sound, because I'm going to show you a little video and the PowerPoint lecture. And there we are, back to the slideshow from the beginning. You can see that this is Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, I'll show you a picture of the book in a few minutes, but I want to talk about Napoleon because he granted rights to Jews in 1804 when there was no empire on the earth that accepted Jews as 100% citizens. And that is what Napoleon Bonaparte did. My husband is Jewish and French, and I've been to Paris many times. And I've asked people, my French is not that good, but the French Jews especially, they love Napoleon Bonaparte. Unlike me, who grew up in Brooklyn, I didn't think very much of Napoleon Bonaparte as a historical figure. But if I had been a European, like my husband, a Jewish boy growing up in Paris, I probably would have loved Napoleon Bonaparte because, as this memorial shows, he granted rights. These are the rights of man. Looks like the 10 Commandments, but it isn't. He granted the rights of man to Jews. This man on bended knee represents Judaism or Jewry, European Jewry. And it's always difficult to get to the next page after the first one. I don't know why. Let's see. There we go. So Napoleon Bonaparte decided to give Jews not only 100% citizenship, but he wanted them to form the Sanhedrin, which was an ancient body of jurists and learned men, the elders of Zion, if you want to know what they were called, the elders of Zion, later on in anti-Semitic literature. But it's the Sanhedrin that Napoleon Bonaparte wanted to restore after 1,000 years of the Jews not being in the Middle East. He wanted to create body of learned men. And so he appoints this man who is the head rabbi. He's wearing a stromal of a very unusual shape. This would be the rabbi of the Sanhedrin. His name was Zitzheim, Daniel Zitzheim. Anyway, here he is, the chief rabbi. Napoleon appointed him because he was a learned man, and Napoleon had respect for learned men of Zion. This is a famous painting where he's granting the Jews citizenship. Nobody, no empire thought to do this, none. Millions of Jews came to France, like my husband's family did, from all over Europe. Doesn't want to go forward. No, there we go. That's the French synagogue in Paris. It's a very old synagogue, and it's quite beautiful inside. My husband was bar mitzvahed in this synagogue. And of course, as I tried to show you, Kol Nidra and many other things about Jewish life were taken completely out of shape, made to turn against the Jews. Anti-Semitism became very popular. The man who published this newspaper, La Libre Parole, his name was Edouard Delmont. His name is up here, Drumont. He was quite a famous intellectual, a man of letters, and this is the year before Alfred Dreyfus is going to go on trial, which is 1894. But in 1893, there was a very big scandal in Paris, and it was called the Panama Scandal, and everybody in the government was ruined. Their reputations were ruined, and it was said that the Jews, two of the people involved in the Panama Scandal, actually it was probably the biggest economic financial scandal of the century. Billions of dollars were funneled into the pockets of corrupt government officials on behalf of the Panama Canal, which had not yet been, the money that was generated to build the Panama Canal was actually stolen by government officials. And in 1893, Edward Delmont blamed it on the Jews. There were 2 Jews involved in the scandal. One committed suicide and the other one, I don't know what happened to him. None of them were punished, but it was a very convenient thing to blame 2 Jews out of hundreds and hundreds of other people who stole that money. French people lost their investments, they lost their lives, they lost everything in that Panama scandal. You can look it up and you'll see how devastating it was. And in 1893, this newspaper came out, and you could tell by the cover that it's not a very pleasant magazine. Here's another one that Delmont published. Here he is, Edward Delmont, and La France Juive, Edition Populaire Illustrée. My French isn't that good. It's an illustrated magazine explaining how the Jews conquered France. And this is the publisher, Edouard Delmont, buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery. He's considered one of the great intellectuals, and lots of people believed him. Why not? He was smart. Lots of smart people believe weird things, or they're so hateful that they don't care if it doesn't make sense that 2 Jews were responsible for the Panama Scandal. It makes no sense. So here is Robert Harris's book, An Officer and a Spy. And everything I've told you so far is mentioned in this novel. This is not a history book. It's not a biography. This is a fiction that the author concocted on behalf of a man named Roman Polanski. And we'll get to that in a minute. Well, actually, maybe I'll tell you now. Roman Polanski and the author of this book, Robert Harris, who is British, have collaborated on several movie plots. Robert Harris wrote the screenplay for Polanski's movie Ghost Rider and several others. So Polanski called Robert Harris and said, come visit me in France and we'll talk about another movie. What could we do? What can we collaborate on together? Well, Robert Harris noticed that Polanski had a lot of books about Alfred Dreyfus in his living room. And he said, well, we could do a book about Dreyfus. And Polanski said, oh, I've been wanting to do a book about Dreyfus for years and years. Can you write the screenplay? Harris said, yes, I'll write the screenplay. But he wasn't sure. And when he began to look into the story of Alfred Dreyfus, he discovered a character who was fascinating, and this is him, Georges Picard. Georges Picard was a military officer, and he is going to become the thrilling character of this novel that Robert Harris fictionalized. Even though everything in the book is accurate about the case, it's a mind-boggling detective case. It's rather shocking. I thought I knew what I needed to know about Dreyfus, but evidently it was so complicated it lasted for several decades. Georges Picard is an officer who is an anti-Semite. Well, what else is new? All of the French military were anti-Semitic. They were just men who didn't value Jews, thought that they didn't deserve to be in the military. Actually, they were good enough to get killed when France fought the Prussians in 1870. That was the Franco-Prussian War, and guess who won? The Prussians won. The French were devastated. They couldn't imagine ever losing to those disgusting Germans. They hate the Germans for centuries. The feeling is mutual on behalf of the Germans, and the Prussians won. And of course, you know who's going to be blamed. That's another reason for the rise of anti-Semitism. Even though Napoleon granted Jews freedom, 100% citizenship, the Jews of France, up until that point, thought of themselves as 100%. They were French. That's what they were. They were French. Then they were Jews after feeling French. But with the Franco-Prussian War and the victory over the French people, somebody had to be blamed. And that is one of the things that contributes to the Dreyfus case, along with the Panama scandal that I explained to you in the 1880s, when it was discovered that the money invested in the Panama Canal, millions of people lost every cent. Well, not millions, but almost all of France had invested in it. Georges Picard. So let's see about him. He's the major character of Harris's novel. And this is Alfred Dreyfus. He was born in 1859 and died in 1935. He was the only officer in the entire military upper staff level. The officers, of the higher up officers, he was the only Jew. And he was not really French in the sense that he was born in Alsace-Lorraine. Well, that is France. The Prussians are going to take that away from them, Alsace and Lorraine, where most of the Jews of France lived. It's going to go back to the German side because the French lose it. But Alfred Dreyfus is going to become the butt of an anti-Semitic covert operation. And before I continue, well, maybe I should do the whole thing. I have a little video of the movie that they made together. Robert Harris wrote this novel, then he wrote the screenplay, and then Roman Polanski made the film, and it came out this year. I wanted to show you a trailer. So, well, let me continue with the photographs. So Alfred Dreyfus is chosen to be the butt of he's chosen as the scapegoat. What is the scapegoating about? And there he is in his mugshot. That's Alfred Dreyfus's mugshot. When they completely uh, remove the buttons and his sword is broken, and they strip him of his military service. And he was a very proud Frenchman. The man who interrogates Alfred Dreyfus for 2 weeks, Dreyfus's wife Lucy had no idea where her husband went. He received a telegram saying to come to the military department in civilian clothing, which he did. And when he got there, he was immediately arrested and put in jail. The man who interrogated Dreyfus for 2 weeks without telling the wife or the family what happened to their husband and father, Armand de Paty de Clam, is the vicious prison guard who gives Dreyfus a gun and says, well, if you want to be a gentleman, blow your brains out and everything will be over, and you will spare the embarrassment of the French military, you will spare the embarrassment of your family. And Dreyfus kept saying, no, I didn't spy. I'm not a spy. I'm not a traitor. I love France, and I'm not going to blow my brains out. Well, here is the problem. Somebody was passing notes to the German embassy. His name was Colonel Schwarzkopf. And the piece of paper that was discovered in the garbage pail of General Schwarzkopf from the German embassy, it seems that the French military had a spy in the German embassy, and it was a woman. I forgot her name, but she cleaned the German embassy, and she was in charge of emptying the garbage pails. So she would go through the garbage pails and take out all the letters that were ripped up in a million pieces, and she would hand them over to the French Secret Service of the military. And one of those letters, it's called the Bordereau, 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 and it was put together in pieces like a jigsaw puzzle. And it was discovered to be the description of a cannon that the French were developing. And the description of the cannon was so precise, it had to be a military person who wrote this to Schwarzkopf. And so they took out a book of all the members of the army who might know about this weapon, this cannon, and they compared the handwritings of the Bordereau, but they really didn't do that. What they actually did was take out the list of servicemen in the higher echelons, and there weren't that many of them, but there was one Jew, and it was his handwriting that happened to look a little bit similar to the Bordereau, but they didn't check anybody else's. They immediately picked the Jewish guy because the handwriting. Now let's remember that back then, people who were educated, they went to school where they were taught penmanship. Almost everybody, as maybe yourself, I know I did when I was in school, we had to write the M exactly like it was on the board. We had to write the C exactly with the curlicue. The T had to be slanted in exactly the same way. So that what's so unusual about people's handwritings looking similar? People were taught how to write by very strict lessons, and it's not surprising that so many handwritings look alike. But they picked Dreyfus because he was a Jew. He didn't belong in the military, they believed. He was only there because he was wealthy, and he was. He was a wealthy Jewish officer from Alsace. His family had a lot of money. Actually, his wife's family had more money than his. But that's how Dreyfus, Alfred Dreyfus, got into the military anyway. It was through his wealth and his status and his privilege. So Paty de Clam hands him a gun to blow his brains out, and he refuses to. And now that's a problem for the military, because they're going to hold a private tribunal. Now, what does that mean? Did they put, a lot of people are confused about this. They think that Alfred Dreyfus went on trial and that you could go and sit there and watch it. No, it was a private trial, a tribunal with only members of the armed forces. It was a military tribunal in which there were no windows and no visitors and no outsiders. And they immediately found Dreyfus guilty. The handwriting looked alike. As a matter of fact, the forensic scientist of the day, forget his name, begins with a B. He didn't know a thing about handwriting analysis, but he knew about fingerprints and he knew about other forensic science. I'm trying to remember his name. It'll come back to me later. But um, anyway, begins with a B. They went to him and he said, yeah, that's the same handwriting. But he wasn't knowledgeable about how to investigate handwriting. It'll come out much later that this famous forensic technician was wrong about the handwriting, but that's way in the future. Right now, they've put Alfred Dreyfus in Devil's Island, and this is one of the photographs showing him and his bed. They chain him to the bed. They lock his feet up in the bars every night. He doesn't get mail from his family for months. There are bugs. He's on an island in French Guiana that's hot as hell. And he's always got a fever. He's always in terrible shape. And this is what the family looked like. His wife's name is Lucy. She took the children out of school immediately so that they wouldn't get taunted by the other children, because her husband was considered a traitor. Everybody hated Dreyfus, except for those who didn't hate him. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, I should backtrack a little bit. Paty Duclum, when he came to tell the wife, Lucy, that her husband has been for 2 weeks in jail, she had no idea. He told her, he warned her, don't you say a word about this to anyone. No one has to know, because this is a military investigation. It deals with treason and you cannot tell anyone. Well, she didn't tell people. In fact, she took her children out of school, and eventually it is going to become knowledgeable to the French public. And it's a way to shut down whenever there is an issue like this. And right now there's a guy named Julian Assange in England in jail, and they're trying to get him to America for treason. He's not even an American citizen. He's from Australia. But Julian Assange, if he ever gets extradited to the United States, he will be tried in a room with no windows in a military tribunal that will be secret. The public will never see it. And the reason that countries do this, whether it's French, German, Polish, or on the moon, the reasoning is this: it's national security, and we cannot reveal the nature of, the Rosenbergs were tried to some degree with this atmosphere. National secrets, security, national security is so important that we cannot reveal this trial to the public. Well, I don't know what you think of that, but it didn't do any good for Dreyfus to be tried in secrecy. He was sent to Devil's Island, where he lay chained to a bed. And it's many years later, many years, maybe 10 years later. This is 1894. Well, okay, around 1900. So six years later, Émile Zola, who really didn't care about any of this, Émile Zola became interested in the story, because all of France was split in half. You were either a Dreyfusard or an anti-Dreyfusard. The Dreyfusards were people who believed Dreyfus was innocent. And remember, the wife was warned never to talk about this, but it did come out. And when it did, Émile Zola took a stand. You were either for Dreyfus or against him. You could not be neutral in France in the 1890s. Even today, right now, there are people who take a position that he was still guilty. Those are very few people, but they're basically in the anti-Semitic department when they claim that Dreyfus was not, that Dreyfus was guilty of treason. So Émile Zola published J'accuse. That's the name of the movie, by the way. The book is called Officer and a Spy. The movie is called J'accuse. And this is a letter to the President of the Republic by Émile Zola. And he blames the military and the officers and the government for committing a crime of scapegoating an innocent man because he's Jewish. Zola was not Jewish. He had written about 25 novels dealing with unfairness in working class France. He wrote books about the miners in the coal mines and the prostitutes and the workers in the fields. He was the greatest author of his day in the 19th century of the working man. And this is a picture of a film. Of course, that's Paul Muni, not that you would recognize him. He's playing the part of Émile Zola, because after Zola published that accusation on the front page of the Aurora newspaper, Zola was put on trial himself for treason, crimes against the government, for attacking the government publicly. And this is a photo from 1936 when Paul Muni played the life of Émile Zola. He got an Academy Award for his performance, and the movie, I think, also got an Academy Award. But in case you think that Émile Zola triumphed, think again. Émile Zola was found guilty. In 3 minutes, they found him guilty, a few minutes, whatever. It was a kangaroo court. It was also a military tribunal, and he was found guilty. And he would be sentenced to 1 year in prison. However, he doesn't go to prison. He goes to England. These are drawings from the trial of Émile Zola. Now, what I haven't told you is that they brought Dreyfus back from Devil's Island, and that's him here. This is this is Picard and Paty Duclam here, and I don't know who this is, maybe the lawyer. These are drawings from the trial. This is Alfred Dreyfus the year that he died, in 1935. But what's going to happen is that because of Émile Zola's articles and his attack upon the government for scapegoating Dreyfus, the entire country took sides. Most people were against Dreyfus. The majority of French people thought that the government was right. How could our military be wrong? And that was the problem. Because after the humiliation of losing to the Prussians and after the scandal of the Panama Canal, how could there be another scandal? It's not possible. France is not that bad. How could there be another scandal? But there was. And the people refused to believe it. So they thought Dreyfus was guilty. And if you didn't take a side, then you couldn't participate in French society at the time. You had to discuss it all day long. People were discussing it. Dreyfus, in the year that he died, this is Rue de Rosier, the Jewish area. This is the area that most Jews, as you could see, this sign tells you that this is the Jewish neighborhood. Jews began in 1900, about 6,000 people arrived from Romania, from Russia, from Austro-Hungary, and another 3,000 around 1914. So this is the neighborhood where Jews live. Dreyfus and his family lived in the 16th arrondissement, which is super duper fancy and rich. These are the poor people of the shtetls, and they came to Rue du Rosier. It's known as the Pletzel or Le Marais. They had names like Finkelstein, which is Polish with the J. You see, it's spelled with a J instead of an I. This is my husband's family, where they come from. They come from Poland and Eastern Europe, and their names are like these, Rubenstein with a J. But nowadays, the North African Jews have populated Paris, and they sell falafel. So these are modern pictures. The Marais is the Jewish area. Today, you cannot afford to live there because it's super duper expensive. It's been gentrified. But back in the day of Dreyfus, this was the area in which a lot of people, Jewish people, were maligned. Of course, they took the side of Dreyfus, and the French have never been afraid of communism. This is Pierre Mendès France. He was a communist, and he was a prime minister. Léon Blum, another Jewish communist who ran the government in France. There's a monument to Léon Blum in Israel. And of course, they took sides. So Marcel Proust, who was Jewish, Remembrance of Things Past, his famous memoir. Now this is Pissarro. Camille Pissarro was born in the Caribbean, but he was Jewish from Sephardic roots. And I know the story behind his life. And when he came to Paris, he created the Impressionist art, or created the Impressionist movement. And Manet, Monet, Renoir, Cézanne, they were all friends of his. Many of them took sides against Dreyfus, and it split the art community. You would imagine that artists would be favorable to the conspiracy theory, because that's what it was. Dreyfus was found guilty twice. They brought him back from Devil's Island, and again, he was found guilty a second time, and Emile Zola was found guilty. This was the rage of France for so many years. And Roman Polanski had been waiting for his whole lifetime to make this movie. The problem is you cannot see it in America. It's banned. He's banned, the movie's banned. I got a copy from Paris, and it has Dutch subtitles. I can't even read the subtitles. So here is a scene from J'accuse. This is Georges Picard, the man who's going to save Alfred Dreyfus. Picard is an anti-Semite. He doesn't like Jews, but what else is new? The entire army didn't like Jews, obviously. It was a thing, you were cultured and you were French, and these Jewish people were German, or, there was always that. Napoleon didn't know what he got everybody into when he gave Jews 100% citizenship. The Jews were proud, but a lot of people were suspicious of Jews because they were so Germanic. Anything Germanic or Prussian was suspicious to them. There's Roman Polanski giving directions to Georges Picard. And the book deals with Georges Picard, the anti-Semite, who was anti-Dreyfus, who is now in charge of the detective bureau in the military. And what's going to happen to Picard, and this is true, that's what the novel is about, it's a detective story. Georges Picard is going to discover that there is somebody sending treasonous notes to General Schwarzkopf. Remember him? Schwarzkopf with the bordereau, and that's how they got Dreyfus in Devil's Island. Oh my goodness, Dreyfus is in Devil's Island. He can't be sending traitorous letters and information about the French army and its cannons to the Germans. How could he be doing that from Devil's Island? And that is when Georges Picard figures out that Dreyfus was framed by the officers who were his commanders. And the whole book is the true story of what led Georges Picard, let's remember he's an anti-Semite, what led Georges Picard to attack the army, his bosses. He goes to them and reveals he knows that they framed an innocent Jew. And they send Picard all the way to Tunisia, which is a colony of the French. And Picard is languishing away in Tunisia. But yes, so they bring Dreyfus back after Zola makes that accusation. They find Zola guilty a second time, and rather than go back to Devil's Island, because it's heartbreaking, what they did to him in Devil's Island, the torment, the torture, he was the only prisoner on the whole island. There were 6 guards, and they were not allowed to speak to him. He suffered terribly because he could not speak for 6 years. And when they brought him back to the tribunal for the second time, he couldn't speak. He could barely open his mouth and say anything. And people looked at him as he was a walking dead man. They were shocked and horrified. And they found him guilty a second time. Yes, when they brought him back after the article in the newspaper that Zola wrote, they found Dreyfus guilty a second time. Rather than go back, he agreed to plead guilty. He just wanted to be with his wife and children, and he said, okay, I'll sign any paper you want. So it ended up where Dreyfus, around 1899, 1900 or so, agreed to plead guilty if he could stay in Paris and be again reunited with his family. But Zola is found guilty in his trial. Instead of going to jail, Zola flees to England. And the man who actually wrote these letters, the real traitor of the story, is a German-Hungarian, Austro-Hungarian soldier in the French military, and his name was Count Esterhazy. So Count Esterhazy is also going to flee. He runs away to England at the same time. They're all in England, and finally, with the movement of Alfred Dreyfus's wife and brother, they finally get the Supreme Court of France to listen to the case. And it's not until 1904, that's 10 years later, 1904, that Dreyfus is going to be announced as an innocent person in every newspaper in the world. And unfortunately, Emile Zola did not get to hear this because he was murdered. It's now known that when Zola died of obnoxious fumes coming out of the, what do you call that thing? The heater. He had a heater in his office, and somebody stuffed up the flue from the roof, making all the fumes backfire into the room. Carbon monoxide is what killed Emile Zola. And we now know that it was done on purpose because the hatred that anti-Dreyfusards, anti-Semites had for Zola, who was not a Jew, but who defended one with all the passion that he had in life. And so his life was taken away by an anti-Semite, anti-Dreyfusard. He never got to see the reunification or the restoration of Alfred Dreyfus to the military. As a matter of fact, Alfred Dreyfus fought in World War I. In 1914, he participates, he can't fight, he's old and frail, but he goes back to war in his uniform. His own son fights in World War I. And I'm going to show you, oh yes, so let me finish up here. After World War I is over, comes the next anti-Semitic accusation. Hitler and all of those men. Now remember what I said about the French losing to the Germans, the humiliation was unbearable. But imagine the Germans losing to the French in World War I. The humiliation was unbearable. It seems like whoever loses a war has to blame somebody. And so you know who's going to get blamed by Hitler in the 1920s, when Hitler is on the rise in Germany. It's going to be the Jews that stabbed the Germans in the back in World War I. They are the cause of the defeat of Kaiser Wilhelm. And now Hitler, in the new republic, in the Weimar Republic, he's blaming the Jews in Germany. And what's going to happen is the roundup of Jews. Now, we know what happens in Germany, but when the Germans get to occupy France, there was a bicycle stadium that's called a velodrome, Velodrome. What you're looking at in this picture is the Velodrome d'Hiver, the winter velodrome for bicycle racing. Gigantic, as you can see, the size of this stadium, it's enormous. And that is where the French soldiers are going to round up, the French police, working for the Vichy government. Only, let's see, Dreyfus is exonerated in 1904. So what is that, 16 more years, 20 something more years, they're going to be rounding up Jews in France, like my husband's family. They all went to this place, this velodrome. The man who interrogated the Jews in the velodrome, and Dreyfus's granddaughter is one of them, by the way. His name is Paty Duclam. Yes, the guy that gave Dreyfus years earlier a gun to blow his brains out so they wouldn't have to put him on trial, they wouldn't have to reveal the spying. Paty Duclam is the interrogator years later in the French assault, the French Holocaust upon the Jews, like my husband's family. So here he is again. This is the evil Paty Duclam. There were anti-Semites in the military, the French military, but not, you know, I hate to break down the word anti-Semitism or anti-Semite, but there were some who were just, for social reasons, class distinction and snobbery, were hateful toward Jews or didn't like them, didn't want to marry them. But then there were others like Paty Duclam, who was a psychopath, and he sent many Jews to their deaths. And so I'm going to show you, stop share. I'll show you, there it is again. I'm going to YouTube. I hope you can hear the sound. Let's see, did I share screen? Share sound. There we go. Make this bigger. You'll have to read the subtitles. These are the coming, this is the trailer for Jacques. Oh, 2019, An Officer and a Spy is the name of the book. And this is the film. I should tell you that his films, Polanski's films, are banned in America. At least this one is. Maybe someday it will be downloadable on Netflix, but right now it isn't.
Au nom du peuple français, le premier conseil de guerre du gouvernement militaire de Paris a reconnu le nommé Dreyfus Alfred coupable du crime de haute trahison.
La leçon à tirer du châtiment de Dreyfus est de montrer au monde ce que nous faisons des traîtres.
Vous êtes désormais responsable du renseignement.
Mon colonel.
Si nous découvrons que Dreyfus n'est pas de traître, je pense que nous devrions agir rapidement dans l'intérêt de l'armée.
Bon Dieu, mon colonel, laissez tomber. Ce sont eux les chefs. Nous suivons leurs ordres.
Je ne veux pas d'une autre affaire Dreyfus.
Ce n'est pas une autre affaire Dreyfus, mon général. C'est la même.
Où est le dossier secret sur Dreyfus? Désormais, je m'en chargerai personnellement.
On intercepte mon courrier. Je suis constamment suivi.
Peux-tu prouver tout cela?
Je voudrais éviter un scandale.
C'est déjà un scandale.
Tu devrais quitter Paris quelque temps.
Et toi?
J'ai l'honneur de vous présenter Monsieur Émile Zola.
Quelqu'un doit exposer toute l'histoire. En tant qu'officier d'actif, je ne peux rien écrire là-dessus.
Vous non, mais moi si.
Demandez, Laurent, demandez.
J'accuse le général Mercier de s'être rendu complice d'une des plus grandes iniquités du siècle.
J'accuse le général Billot d'avoir eu les preuves de l'innocence de Dreyfus et de les avoir étouffées.
J'accuse les experts en écriture d'avoir fait des rapports frauduleux.
Traître.
Quand une société en est là,
Assassin.
elle tombe en décomposition.
Au nom du peuple français, le premier conseil de guerre du gouvernement militaire de Paris a reconnu le nommé Dreyfus Alfred coupable du crime de haute trahison.
La leçon à tirer du châtiment de Dreyfus est de montrer au monde ce que nous faisons des traîtres.
Vous êtes désormais responsable du renseignement.
Mon colonel,
Si nous découvrons que Dreyfus n'est pas de traître, je pense que nous devrions agir rapidement dans l'intérêt de l'armée.
bon Dieu, mon colonel, laissez tomber. Ce sont eux les chefs. Nous suivons leurs ordres.
Je ne veux pas d'une autre affaire Dreyfus.
Ce n'est pas une autre affaire Dreyfus, mon général. C'est la même.
Où est le dossier secret sur Dreyfus? Désormais, je m'en chargerai personnellement.
On intercepte mon courrier. Je suis constamment suivi.
Peux-tu prouver tout cela?
Je voudrais éviter un scandale.
C'est déjà un scandale.
Tu devrais quitter Paris quelque temps.
Et toi?
J'ai l'honneur de vous présenter Monsieur Émile Zola.
Quelqu'un doit exposer toute l'histoire. En tant qu'officier d'actif, je ne peux rien écrire là-dessus.
Vous non, mais moi si.
Demandez, Laurent, demandez.
J'accuse le général Mercier de s'être rendu complice d'une des plus grandes iniquités du siècle.
J'accuse le général Billot d'avoir eu les preuves de l'innocence de Dreyfus et de les avoir étouffées.
J'accuse les experts en écriture d'avoir fait des rapports frauduleux.
Traître.
Quand une société en est là,
Assassin.
elle tombe en décomposition.
Okay, I played that twice because it goes too fast. Stop share, and I'm back in business. The name of the forensic authority was Bertillon, Bertillon. What? What's going on there? Just a minute. Ay, ay, ay. Oh,
It involved an assimilated.
that's somebody else giving a book review there. Okay, so I have to get back, stop share. All right, that YouTube, it just goes on and on. YouTube is wonderful. You could find a lot of things about Dreyfus. If you're interested on that subject, just go to YouTube and put in Dreyfus and you'll probably find the people who hate him and who still believe in 2021 that he was guilty, because that's on the internet as well. The anti-Semitism never goes away. Thank goodness most people understand that Dreyfus was framed. His granddaughter died in Auschwitz, and the forensic scientist that I mentioned had no knowledge of handwriting, and he just went along. Everybody went along because the guy was a Jew. And I have to tell you one more thing. It's not in the movie, but if you remember the scenes, maybe they weren't in the coming attractions, but when the scene that opens the film and the book follow the case explicitly and perfectly in every way, the costumes, the buttons on the coats, and the language, everything about it is accurate historically. And one of the things that I was blown away by was when I found out that the maddening crowds that are screaming, kill him, kill Dreyfus, because there were thousands, 20,000 people witnessed the humiliating, button ripping, sword breaking in the armed guard arena, as you saw at the beginning of the film. One of the people in that crowd was a guy named Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl came away from that event as you all know, realizing that it didn't matter if Napoleon granted you 100% citizenship, nobody was going to protect Jews if Jews didn't protect themselves by having a place of their own. And so they went to Basel, Switzerland. Theodor Herzl wrote a book, The Nation State. I think I have a copy, I forgot the name. And the idea of Zionism became very, very strong among all Europeans, not just the Eastern European Russians and shtetl Jews in Poland and Ukraine, not just them, but the French, the Romanians, Hungarian Jews. Dreyfus's case caused so many to leave Europe or to dream about a Zionist place, dream about Zionism. Okay, so what else can I tell you? I think you can look the rest up yourself. And if that movie ever comes around, try to find it. You can get a copy. I bought a copy from Paris, but it came with Danish subtitles. The book is very interesting because it's a detective story. It's fiction, but based on the accurate details of how Georges Picard, an anti-Semite, probably was never convinced that Jews were, for all I know, he maintained his attitude toward Jews, but he wanted the reason this is such a great story isn't just because justice prevailed, but it only prevailed because Georges Picard wanted the truth more than he wanted to see a Jew wrongly convicted. In other words, it shows you the differences between types of anti-Semitism. At least for me, that's what it did. It shows that there were honorable people. They had their attitudes, social snobbery, whatever you want to call it, but they couldn't see even a person that they looked down upon, that they thought their country mattered more. And that was where Georges Picard was coming from. They were all very devoted military officers, but some were more devoted to France than others. And some recognized that the French government, the whole country was falling to pieces in corruption. And it was the darkness of the military tribunals, because they only had their trials in private. None of it was public. And when you do stuff in darkness, you could do whatever you want. And Picard thought that was wrong. And thanks to him, history was changed, because Émile Zola was not interested until Picard risked his life. And he came back from Tunisia. They sent him away so that he couldn't make trouble for them. And Count Esterhazy was the culprit. And he was put, oh, I forgot to tell you, he was put on trial. Yeah. The real traitor was put on trial. Want to know what happened? 3 minutes. In 3 minutes, Esterhazy's jury, a military tribunal, found him not guilty, even though he confessed. 3 minutes it took them. And Esterhazy fled France to England. In those days, England didn't have extradition treaties, and you couldn't get somebody back to France from England. Karl Marx fled there. Zola fled there. Lots of Oscar Wilde fled. Well, it was actually in England where he had his trial. Anyway, Esterhazy lives out the rest of his life, many years. He lived a long life in a small village in England. So that's the story of Alfred Dreyfus, and I can't think of anything more to tell you. So thank you for your patience, and be well, and a happy holiday to all of you.